Consciousness and what is unconscious. In this introductory chapter, there is nothing new to be said, and it will not be possible to avoid repeating what has often been said before. The division of the psychical into what is conscious and what is unconscious is the fundamental premise of psychoanalysis, and it alone makes it possible for psychoanalysis to understand the pathological processes in mental life, which are as common as they are important, and to find a place for them in the framework of science. To put it once more, in a different way, psychoanalysis cannot situate the essence of the psychical in consciousness, but is obliged to regard consciousness as a quality of the psychical, which may be present in addition to other qualities or may be absent. If I could suppose that everyone interested in psychology would read this book, I should also be prepared to find that at this point some of my readers would already stop short and would go no further. For here we have the first shibboleth of psychoanalysis. To most people who have been educated in philosophy, the idea of analytic psychical, anything psychical which is not also conscious, is so inconceivable that it seems to them absurd and refutable simply by logic. I believe this only because they have never studied the relevant phenomena of hypnosis and dreams, which, quite apart from pathological manifestations, necessitate this view. Their psychology of consciousness is incapable of solving the problems of dreams and hypnosis. Being conscious is in the first place a purely descriptive term, resting on perception of the most immediate and certain character. Experience goes on to show that a psychical element, for instance, an idea, is not as a rule conscious for a protracted length of time. On the contrary, a state of consciousness is characteristically very transitory. An idea that is conscious now is no longer so a moment later, although it can become so again under certain conditions that are easily brought about. In the interval the idea was, we do not know what. We can say that it was latent, and by this we mean that it was capable of becoming conscious at any time. Or, if we say that it was unconscious, we shall also be giving a correct description of it. Here unconscious coincides with latent and capable of becoming conscious. The philosophers would no doubt object, no, the term unconscious is not applicable here. So long as the idea was in a state of latency, it was not anything psychical at all. To contradict them at this point would lead to nothing more profitable than a verbal dispute. But we have arrived at the term or concept of the unconscious along another path, by considering certain experiences in which mental dynamics play a part. We have found, that is, we have been obliged to assume that very powerful mental processes or ideas exist, and here a quantitative or economic factor comes into question for the first time, which can produce all the effects in mental life that ordinary ideas do, including effects that can in turn become conscious as ideas, though they themselves do not become conscious. It is unnecessary to repeat in detail here what has been explained so often before. It is enough to say that at this point psychoanalytic theory steps in and asserts that the reason why such ideas cannot become conscious is that a certain force opposes them, that otherwise they could become conscious, and that it would then be apparent how little they differ from other elements which are admittedly psychical. The fact that in the technique of psychoanalysis a means has been found by which the opposing force can be removed and the ideas in question made conscious, renders this theory irrefutable. The state in which the ideas existed before being made conscious is called by us repression, and we assert that the force which instituted the repression and maintains it is perceived as resistance during the work of analysis. Thus we obtain our concept of the unconscious from the theory of repression. The repressed is the prototype of the unconscious for us. We see, however, that we have two kinds of unconscious. The one which is latent but capable of becoming conscious, and the one which is repressed and which is not, in itself, without more ado, capable of becoming conscious. This piece of insight into psychical dynamics cannot fail to affect terminology and description. The latent, which is unconscious, only descriptively, not in the dynamic sense, we call preconscious. We restrict the term unconscious to the dynamically unconscious repressed, so that now we have three terms: conscious, preconscious, and unconscious, whose sense is no longer purely descriptive. The preconscious is presumably a great deal closer to the conscious than is the unconscious, and since we have called the unconscious psychical, we shall with even less hesitation call the latent preconscious psychical. But why do we not rather, instead of this, remain in agreement with the philosophers and, in a consistent way, distinguish the preconscious as well as the unconscious from the conscious psychical? The philosophers would then propose that the preconscious and the unconscious should be described as two species or stages of the psychoid, and harmony would be established. But less difficulties in exposition would follow. And one important fact, that these two kinds of psychoid coincidence in almost every other respect with what is admittedly psychical, would be forced into the background in the interests of a prejudice dating from a period in which these psychoids, or the most important part of them, were still unknown. We can now play about comfortably with our three terms, conscious, preconscious, and unconscious, so long as we do not forget that in the descriptive sense there are two kinds of unconscious, but in the dynamic sense only one. For purposes of exposition, this distinction can in some cases be ignored, but in others it is of course indispensable. At the same time, we have become more or less accustomed to this ambiguity of the unconscious and have managed pretty well with it. As far as I can see, it is impossible to avoid this ambiguity. The distinction between conscious and unconscious is the last resort, a question of perception, which must be answered yes or no, and the fact of perception itself tells us nothing of the reason why a thing is or is not perceived. No one has a right to complain because the actual phenomenon expresses the dynamic factor ambiguously. This may be compared so far with my note on the unconscious in psychoanalysis, a new turn taken by criticisms if the unconscious deserves consideration at this point. Some investigators who do not refuse to recognize the facts of psychoanalysis, but who are unwilling to accept the unconscious, find a way out of the difficulty in the fact, which no one contests, that in consciousness, regarded as a phenomenon, it is possible to distinguish a great variety of gradations in intensity or clarity, just as there are processes which are vividly, glaringly, and tangibly conscious. So we also experience others which are only faintly, hardly even noticeably conscious. Those that are most faintly conscious are, it is argued, the ones to which psychoanalysis wishes to apply the unsuitable name unconscious. These 2, however, the argument proceeds, are conscious or in consciousness, and can be made fully and intensely conscious if sufficient attention is paid to them. Insofar as it is possible to influence by arguments the decision of a question of this kind, which depends either on convention or on emotional factors, we may make the following comments. The reference to gradations of clarity in consciousness is no way conclusive and has no more evidential value than such analogous statements as there are so very many gradations in illumination, from the most glaring and dazzling light to the dimmest glimmer. Therefore, there is no such thing as darkness at all, or there are varying degrees of vitality. Therefore, there is no such thing as death. Such statements may in a certain way have a meaning, but for practical purposes they are worthless. This will be seen if one tries to draw particular conclusions from them, such as, there is therefore no need to strike a light, or therefore all organisms are immortal. Further, to include what is unnoticeable under the concept of what is conscious is simply to play havoc with the one and only piece of direct and certain knowledge that we have about the mind. And after all, a consciousness of which one knows nothing seems to me a good deal more absurd than something mental that is unconscious. Finally, this attempt to equate what is unnoticed with what is unconscious is obviously made without taking into account the dynamic conditions involved, which were the decisive factors in forming the psychoanalytic view. For it ignores two facts. First, that it is exceedingly difficult and requires very great effort to concentrate enough attention on something unnoticed of this kind, and secondly, that when this has been achieved, the thought which was previously unnoticed is not recognized by consciousness, but often seems entirely alien and opposed to it, and is promptly disavowed by it, thus seeking refuge from the unconscious in what is scarcely noticed, or unnoticed is, after all, only a derivative of the preconceived beliefs, which regards the identity of the psychical and the conscious as settled once and for all. In the further course of psychoanalytic work, however, even these distinctions have proved to be inadequate and, for practical purposes, insufficient. This has become clear in more ways than one, but the decisive instance is as follows. We have formed the idea in each individual there is a coherent organization of mental processes, and we call this his ego. It is to this ego that consciousness is attached. The ego controls the approaches to motility, that is, to the discharge of excitations into the external world. It is the mental agency which supervises all its own constituent processes, and which goes to sleep at night, though even then it exercises the censorship on dreams. From this ego proceed the repressions, too, by means of which it is sought to exclude certain trends in the mind, not merely from consciousness, but also from other forms of effectiveness and activity. In analysis, these trends which have been shut out stand in opposition to the ego, and the analysis is faced with the task of removing the resistances which the ego displays against concerning itself with the repressed. Now we find during analysis that when we put certain tasks before the patient, he gets into difficulties. His associations fail when they should be coming near the repressed. We then tell him that he is dominated by resistance, but he is quite unaware of the fact, and even if he guesses from this unpleasurable feelings that a resistance is now at work in him, he does not know what it is or how to describe it, since, however, there can be no question but that this resistance emanates from his ego and belongs to it. We find ourselves in an unforeseen situation. We have come upon something in the ego which is also unconscious, which behaves exactly like the repressed, that is, which produces powerful effects without itself being conscious, and which requires special work before it can be made conscious. From the point of view of analytic practice, the consequences of this discovery is that we land in endless obscurities and difficulties if we keep to our habitual forms of expression and try, for instance, to derive neuroses from a conflict between the conscious and the unconscious. We shall have to substitute for this antithesis another, taken from our insight into the structural conditions of the mind, the antithesis between a coherent ego and the repressed which is split off from it. For our conception of the unconscious, however, the consequences of our discovery are even more important. Dynamic considerations caused us to make our first correction. Our insight into the structure of the mind leads to the second. We recognize that the unconscious does not coincide with the repressed. It is still true that all that is repressed is unconscious, but not all that is unconscious is repressed. A part of the ego, too, and heaven knows how important the part, may be unconscious, undoubtedly is unconscious. And this unconscious belonging to the ego is not latent like the preconscious, for if it were, it could not be activated without becoming conscious, and the process of making it conscious would not encounter such great difficulties. When we find ourselves thus confronted by the necessity of postulating a third unconscious, which is not repressed, we must admit that the characteristic of being unconscious begins to lose significance for us. It becomes a quality which can have many meanings, a quality which we are unable to make, as we should have hoped to, the basis of far-reaching and inevitable conclusions. Nevertheless, we must beware of ignoring this characteristic, for the property of being conscious or not is in the last resort our one beacon light in the darkness of that psychology.